The moment Mauricio Umansky looked into a camera and called Lala Kent a liar, something shifted. Not just in the drama, in the dynamic. Because Mauricio has spent the better part of 3 years being remarkably composed in public while his personal life got dissected, speculated on, and occasionally dragged through the mud by people who didn't know half the story. He has watched his marriage to Kyle Richards become tabloid fodder. He has sat through months of people reading into every Instagram like, every absence, every carefully worded statement about their separation. He has kept his voice low and his responses measured in a way that honestly made me think he had a very good publicist and an even better poker face. So when he dropped the word liar with that level of sharpness, that specific, almost irritated certainty, it caught my attention in a way that a more theatrical outburst wouldn't have. This wasn't a dramatic reality TV moment designed for a confessional. This felt like someone who was genuinely annoyed. And that distinction matters more than people are giving it credit for. Let me set up what actually happened here, because the details are doing a lot of work. Lala Kent went on her podcast, untraditionally Lala, and told her listeners that Mauricio had slid into her messages asking about grabbing coffee. And the way she framed it was interesting. She said she wasn't sure what his intentions were. She said it happened because she'd mentioned him on a previous episode. And she made a specific point, a very deliberate point, of saying she hadn't opened the message. Hadn't read it. Hadn't responded. Now on the surface, that framing functions as a kind of flattery shield. Like, yes, this person reached out to me, no I didn't engage, I'm unbothered. It positions her as someone being pursued while maintaining the narrative that she isn't chasing anything back. In podcast storytelling terms, it's a clean setup. You introduce a moment of intrigue, position yourself as the cooler party, and let your audience fill in the rest. The problem is the text itself. Because Mauricio came forward and told his version of events, and his version had a specific structural detail that completely undermined Lala's story. He said that yes, he did message her, but the coffee mention came at the very end. The end of a longer message. Which means that if Lala knew coffee was involved at all, she had to have read the whole thing. You can't paraphrase the tail end of a message you claim you never opened. That's not a gray area. That's a factual inconsistency, and it's the kind of inconsistency that unravels a lot about why Mauricio felt the need to respond publicly in the first place. Because here's what I think is actually happening beneath the surface of this whole situation. Mauricio didn't reach out to Lala for a date. He reached out, by his own account, because she was talking about him on her platform and he wanted her to say whatever she was going to say directly to him. That is a specific kind of frustration. The frustration of someone who has had their name in other people's mouths for years, who has watched commentary about him circulate through a Bravo-adjacent media ecosystem without his participation, and who finally decided he was done just absorbing it quietly. That impulse is understandable. Genuinely. When someone is talking about you publicly and you can reach them, the instinct to say, come have this conversation with me, not about me, is a real one. It's not necessarily romantic. It's not even necessarily aggressive. It's just someone who is tired of being a topic. And yet, Lala turned it into one anyway. Which is exactly what he was trying to avoid. This is where the psychology gets complicated, because I don't think this situation is straightforwardly about one person being wrong and one person being right. I think it's about two public figures with two very different kinds of emotional survival strategies colliding in a way that was always going to create friction. Lala Kent has been in a genuinely difficult personal space for a few years now. The end of her relationship with Randall Emmett was not a quiet breakup. It was a public unwinding, played out across multiple Vanderpump Rules seasons, complete with humiliation and betrayal that she did not get to process privately. She has talked openly about how that experience broke her ability to trust people. She has talked about the difficulty of dating after everything that happened. And she is now raising 2 children, one of whom she had on her own, and doing that on top of maintaining a podcast, a career, and a public profile. I say all of that not to excuse anything, but to understand the emotional framework she is operating inside. When you have had your trust demolished in a very visible way, you develop very specific self-protection patterns. One of those patterns can be controlling the narrative before someone else does. Getting out in front of a story. shaping how a moment is perceived before the other person has a chance to shape it differently. The decision to mention Mauricio's message on her podcast before responding to it, or even admitting she'd read it, starts to look less like casual oversharing and more like a very deliberate act of preemptive framing. Whether that framing was conscious or not is genuinely something I can't tell you. People don't always know when they're doing it. But here's what makes this specific situation sticky. The thing Lala apparently got wrong, factually, is small enough that she may have genuinely not thought it would matter. Like, maybe in her mind, saying she hadn't opened it was close enough to hadn't engaged with it meaningfully, that she felt like she was telling an emotional truth even if the literal details were off. People do that constantly in interviews and podcasts. They round their stories. They edit for narrative clarity. They take the version of events that feels most emotionally accurate to them and present it as the factual record. The problem is that Mauricio, a man who has had a lot of things said about him in the last 3 years that he couldn't easily correct, was not in the mood to let an inaccurate version of his behavior live unchallenged. And he had receipts. He shared the text. And when the text went public, the reaction was swift and honestly kind of fascinating from a fan psychology perspective. Because the comment sections didn't really split into camps the way they sometimes do with Bravo drama. Instead, there was a fairly unified response that can be summarized as, "That man was not trying to date you." People who went into this story potentially sympathetic to Lala's framing came out of it reassessing what she had presented. Not because they hate her, but because the evidence was right there. That matters because Lala Kent's relationship with the Bravo audience has always been a complicated one. She has genuine fans, people who have followed her emotional journey across multiple seasons and who root for her to land somewhere stable and happy. But she has also cultivated a persona that is deliberately provocative, self-aware about its own drama-generating tendencies, and not always careful about the line between being entertainingly candid and being genuinely unfair to people she's discussing. And when she crosses that line with someone who has the receipts and the willingness to use them, the audience recalibrates quickly. What I keep thinking about, though, is what this exchange reveals about where both of them are right now in terms of public image and narrative control. Mauricio is in an interesting position. He is, technically speaking, in a transitional period, estranged from his wife, navigating a public separation that has never legally formalized, running a real estate business that has also had its complications. He does not have a show that is actively centering him right now. He is not in a confessional chair weekly, shaping how people receive him. He exists mostly in the spaces between tabloid mentions, interviews, the occasional social media moment. And in that environment, letting someone's inaccurate podcast story define him felt like a risk he wasn't willing to take. There's something almost protective about how he handled it, actually. He didn't escalate into a performance. He went to TMZ, stated his case with specificity, threatened the receipts, then delivered them. It was methodical. It was calm in a way that read as confidence rather than aggression. And the clarity of the text itself, the fact that it wasn't flirtatious, wasn't suggestive, wasn't the kind of message that would embarrass him in the reading, meant that sharing it cost him nothing while it cost Lala quite a bit in terms of credibility. That's a very calculated piece of self-defense, whether he meant it to be or not. And now Lala has to figure out how to respond to being publicly fact-checked by the person she mentioned on her podcast. That's an uncomfortable position. Because she can't unsay what she said. She can't unpresent the story the way she presented it. Her options are to acknowledge the inaccuracy, double down, go quiet, or find a way to reframe the whole thing as something other than what it appears to be. Each of those choices carries its own set of consequences. And the audience is watching to see which one she picks. What I find genuinely interesting is how this moment sits against the backdrop of Lala's career arc right now. She is on the valley. She is still figuring out what version of herself the Bravo ecosystem wants from her post-Vanderpump Rules, and more importantly, what version of herself she actually wants to present. The Lala Kent who was on Vanderpump Rules in the early seasons and the Lala Kent who exists now are not the same person, and she has said that herself. She has grown. She has genuinely processed some things. But growth doesn't erase the old patterns entirely, and sometimes under pressure, the old instincts come roaring back. Whether that's what happened here, whether this was a protective habit reasserting itself, or whether there's something else entirely going on that neither of us has full visibility into, I genuinely don't know. And I want to be careful about pretending I do. What I do know is that this particular moment is going to follow both of them for a while. Not because it's catastrophic, but because it's specific. It's documented. The text is out there. The podcast episode is out there. The TMZ interview is out there. And in the Bravo universe, where people have very long memories and screenshots live forever, specificity is the thing that tends to stick. I'm curious what you think. Do you believe Lala genuinely misremembered the details, or does this feel more intentional to you? And does Mauricio releasing that text change how you see how he handles his public image? Leave it in the comments, because I want to know where people are landing on this one. Because I'm honestly still turning it over. Something about the whole exchange feels like it has a layer we haven't seen yet.